Do you remember when Janet Yellen's talking about the $1 trillion coin, which is about $20,000 worth of platinum in it? And that's what they said. Okay, everyone, this is a $1 trillion coin. I'm going to put this in the bank and now we can borrow more money. Do you guys see how insane this is? I'm sorry. I should just shut up and put my head down and not say a word, but wow. As promised, I want to talk to you about all the bankruptcies, delinquencies, and defaults that I expect are going to rise significantly going forward. It's going to be a thing on the news you're going to see a lot about. You're going to hear a lot about big name companies that are having a lot of financial difficulties. Sorry to bring it down, but I'm going to talk about personal bankruptcies, corporate bankruptcies. I'm going to talk about delinquencies, and I'm going to talk about defaults, the big one. Has the government ever defaulted? We'll talk about all of that. I'll tell you the number one reason that people declare bankruptcy and how the age group is aging. It's getting older. The people that declare bankruptcy are an older age group. I'm going to get into all this stuff in this video. We never give personalized trading advice in any of these videos from Peter Leeds. Now I'm going to talk about defaults, delinquencies, and bankruptcies. What's the difference? I'll do you a quick, skinny definition or overview to tell you the difference between the three, but they're all the same underlying problem. A bankruptcy is when a company or a person gets bills in the mail and they're like, I cannot afford to pay these bills. And sometimes there's so much weight of liabilities on a person or a corporation, it's easier just to go, I throw in the towel, let me be protected beneath bankruptcy laws, which will help me get a breath as we divvy up whatever is left of whatever I have and give it out to who I owe it to. I'll give you a bunch of examples of this just a little bit further ahead in this video. But I also want to talk about delinquencies. The delinquency rate is actually very low right now. It's very strong right now. And this is part of the problem. I think that this is going to be starting from a low base and there's going to be a sudden surge. And a lot of what you're seeing in all of this video does not yet take into account any meaningful impact from the interest rate increases. People will be paying more money, yes. Carrying costs will be greater, yes. But it takes a while to really soak in. If there's a company, for example, that's on the verge of bankruptcy and you raise interest rates, they can still go for months, quarters, before the increased interest rates and the higher payments actually affect the company. And that's why I think that we are right at the tipping point where we're about to begin to have the effects of the interest rate increases meeting up with a lot of people and corporations that are financially troubled right now. And you know this to be true. There's a lot of people and a lot of companies that are having a bit more trouble making money, saving money, paying down their bills than there ever has been. A delinquency is when you have a car payment and they send you a bill for the car payment and you say, I'm not going to pay this bill for whatever reason, and then you don't pay it. And you can track people 30 days later, 60 days later, 90 days later, and watch the trends going through. We'll get into all this in this video, but you can see how a lot of times the people that really linger in default typically don't escape their defaulting situation. I'll say it that way. I think you know what I mean. So what's a default? You have a contract, a bond, a government treasury bill that the government says, you lend us this money, we will pay you back this money at a future date, and we'll give you interest payments the whole way. Bonds are just about transferring money from one place to another. And every time you're going to do that, the counterparty is going to want to have some value. So if you buy bonds in a country that is in the middle of a war, they're going to have to give you a greater interest rate on those bonds for it to be worth your while to put some money into the economy of the war-torn country. They'll pay you maybe double-digit interest rates on those bonds. But I'm talking about the government when they have bonds outstanding, and if they don't pay them, or corporations, they have bonds outstanding and don't pay them. They don't pay the obligation that they signed on to pay at an earlier date, and now that day shows up. That is the worst. It's the biggest effect of all the things I'm talking about that's going to have on you directly. So has the American government ever defaulted? You know, corporations have, you know that individuals have, but has the American government ever defaulted? We'll get into that in this video. I'll give you examples and we'll talk all about this. Okay, we're going to start with delinquencies. This is from Guru Focus. Auto loan delinquencies on the rise. I got to show you certain things that they say in this article. Lower inventories, higher prices, and reduced demand. among other factors, are central to some of the changing dynamics in the auto industry market, resulting in a rise in auto loan delinquency rates. Well, those inventories are about to balloon. Those higher prices are about to come down for used cars and new cars as well. I believe demand will be about the same as always, maybe a bit lower because of the economic hardships we're all facing. A key observation and study is the total number of delinquencies. It's above pandemic lows, but is primarily driven by the backlog of likely delinquencies that were temporarily in accommodation or bolstered by the pandemic-related government relief and other stimulus programs. You get it? There would be a lot more delinquencies if not for government intervention, government clumsy intervention. And here is a couple of charts that'll give you a little bit more color to what we're talking about. Days past due, you can see every year, 30 days past due, 60 days past due, 90 days past due. We'll start in 2018, it went from 0.39% to where it is now, 0.79%. Still, anything under 1% is absolutely low. And you can see that 30 days past due is a bigger number, 3.34%. But then as time goes on, a lot of these people will wind up making the payments. So by the time it gets to 90 days past due, that's less than 1% of people. This article is from Forbes. It's the audio version of it, so sounds like a robot's saying it, but rather than me read it to you, let's hear what Robot Betty has to say. From Forbes.
Probability of default is rising for high-yield bonds and leveraged loans. In another sign that the U.S. economy is headed for a rough landing, leveraged loans and high-yield bonds' probability of default and actual defaults continue to rise.
This is from CFO, a publication popular among chief financial officers. But anyway, here's U.S. corporate bankruptcies down 16% in September. Now remember, there's two different types of bankruptcy, personal and corporate. I'm talking about both here, but you'll notice that it's actually not too bad in either case right now, which is my whole point. We are about to have a major rise from a low base, and it's going to be pretty extreme. And once the media starts noticing it, once it starts rolling out, then it's going to be common in the news across everywhere. It will become known. But this is talking about corporate filings specifically. Corporate bankruptcy filings in the United States are at their lowest in more than a decade. And that's after a lot of these big bankruptcies you heard about. There's a few in the cryptocurrency space recently. There was a few others that were notable. There were 31 filings of bankruptcy in September, which is a 16% dip from the 37 filings in August. That's in the United States, and they're at their lowest in more than a decade. At the end of last month, 279 companies filed for bankruptcy in 2022, which the S&P reports is the lowest since at least 2010. 2022 has seen few mid-sized and large businesses go belly up. Leading the way as an industry was industrials, with 48 filings as the end of September. Next was consumer discretionary businesses with 43 bankruptcies. Healthcare was next with 28 filings. But here's a chart of corporate bankruptcy filings in 2022. This was the thing that I never mention on camera because it'll hurt my videos through the algorithm, which is why nobody ever actually says what they want to say. Expect the number of bankruptcies to be relatively range-bound for a while before it spikes higher. So we're talking between 30 and 40 per month of corporations. Here's something I want to say about what Chris Hudgens said in this article. He's a data analyst at S&P Global Intelligence. One thing he said down here I want to show you. He said a lot of things, but we saw a large number of filings in 2020 as many of the most vulnerable companies filed for bankruptcy during the thing we went through. Some of those companies might have been able to hold out a bit longer under normal circumstances, but they were instead pushed over the edge into bankruptcy due to economic conditions. What I want to say about this is that, yes, that's true, but also with the stimulus measures, there's a lot of companies that would have declared bankruptcy that didn't have to. This is making an unnatural situation for us, an unnatural setup. When the government steps out of the way, they're going to have set up a situation where there will be more bankruptcies because of their involvement. There always these clunky doggies getting in there, getting elected by saying that they'll do this and that, and they go and do this and that, but it's stupid. Speaking of which, did you see that the United Kingdom's Prime Minister, Liz Truss, resigned? Well, at least the people are aware what the bad mistakes are going to be. Everything they're trying to do in the United Kingdom will be counterproductive, and I guess the people recognize that, because I attribute that to some really smart people that put a lot of pressure on her and called out the facts that made her resign. And an assist goes to all the new technology we have that I could be talking to you right now. You could be in the United Kingdom watching this video and be learning things and understand that you need to stand up to these huge, glaring, obvious, demonstrable mistakes that they were about to make. He also said that given the current economic conditions and rising interest rates, he would expect to see the pace of bankruptcy filings pick up in the future. Thank you. That's what I'm telling you. Here's a chart. U.S. bankruptcy filings by year as of September 30th. This was a bad year, then it came down in relation to it. So it seems like it's getting better. And right here, this is a 10-year high, according to this article, of corporate bankruptcies, 2020. It seems to be getting better, but it'll get a little bit better and it'll then turn around and shoot higher. The effect of the interest rates haven't kicked in yet. They are going to begin affecting corporations now. As interest rates are increasing, credit availability is getting more limited and costly. Banks are also starting to tighten their lending standards, Hodgson said. Companies looking to finance debt might find it difficult and more expensive, which could prove even more troublesome for those with large debt sums coming due as their options for refinancing narrow. Yes, thank you. And here's a couple examples I gave you. OSG Group Holdings, Aereo Technologies, and Celsius Network each had more than $1 billion in liabilities at the time of their filings. And liabilities are just debts, what they owe. If you owe me $10, that's a liability of $10 to you.
The days of low interest rates have changed dramatically. As I have written about for almost a decade, American companies have been gorging themselves at the trough of debt. That regulatory tone, together with a low interest rate environment, enabled companies to reach historic levels of indebtedness.
Here's 20 large companies that filed Chapter 11 bankruptcy in the first half of the year. You know what? I'm not even going to read this article. You guys get it. There's examples in there. I don't care. And you know I'm right. And I already teased a little bit about this article. Here's a chart here. I'll get into the screenshot. You can take a look at the different states and the numbers of bankruptcies declared. Understand that as personal bankruptcies, right? Most cases of bankruptcy aren't caused by reckless spending, but by financial hardship. And many are lower income individuals who simply can't afford to deal with unexpected major expenses, such as job loss or medical bills. In 1980, businesses accounted for 13% of bankruptcies. The rest was all personal bankruptcies. But now, today, that was 1980, now today, business bankruptcies only account for 3% of total bankruptcies. That's a lot more people, a bigger relationship in terms of percentage anyways, that are filing for bankruptcy compared to how many corporations are. And this is an old study, 2008, said 46% of bankruptcies were related to outstanding medical conditions. Injury or illness, medical expenses not covered by insurance, or losing at least 2 weeks' worth of work because of illness. But since 2005, common reported causes of bankruptcy include reduced income, job loss, which we're going to see a lot more of coming up relatively soon, credit debt, and it's going to be harder to pay the debts we have, and listen to this, unexpected expenses, and finally, preparing for divorce. Today, the average filer is older and married, has a high school education, and makes less than $30,000 a year. Since the 1990s, bankruptcy has been increasing among the older age group, while more senior citizens are declaring bankruptcy, and that's going to be a big part of the bankruptcies you're going to see, because there's not enough money for what people are expecting to get. You just saw what was happening in the United Kingdom. They had a pension crisis out of nowhere. Not out of nowhere. People saw it coming and nobody did anything about it. Sort of like America right now. Married individuals are making up increasing portion of bankruptcies, more than 64% in 2010. That number includes married couples filing jointly. 17% of debtors are single, 15% are divorced, and 3% are widowed. This was an article by Bill Fay. Do you see how they're playing these ridiculous games just to try and confuse you and muddy the waters? As long as there's two people arguing about something, then nothing can get done. And you can't see the reality of where the fraud is, where the overspending is, where the fiscal irresponsibility is, because there's all this dust in the air. Everyone's kicking mud at each other. And so we're not dealing with the problem, which is so clearly evident. We're spending too much money. We're not bringing in enough money. The economy has become weaker. There's things we can do to fix it, but not really anymore in terms of getting out from underneath this debt bomb. It will never be paid off. It will only grow. It may be paid down in short windows of time, but in general, it will never come close to being paid off. So how do you think this ends? I'm actually asking you, what do you think? Do you think that we just one day figure it out? Or do we just learn to live with debt? And of course, we learn to live with debt, but it gets bigger and bigger. And yeah, you can't kick the can anymore because the can's too big. The can down the road is ending. You're at a cliff. This is where, and I told you a couple years ago, this is already too late. We are well past the point of no return. I wrote an article that got picked up by U.S. Congress about America being past the point of no return. Probably 2014, I think it was. But the point of the article wasn't that we were past the point of no return. It was that there's things we could do to fix this complete clown show that we're dealing with right now. And I'll make a video one day about all this stuff, but I don't want to talk about that right now.
Rising rates by several key central banks around the world have not been able to slay significant inflationary pressures that have arisen, especially due to COVID-induced supply chain issues. Hence, American companies face rising prices of many inputs from around the world.
And this article is from the United States courts. Bankruptcy filings take a sharp drop. Bankruptcy filings have fallen almost steadily since the peak in 2010. That trend has accelerated since the pandemic began in early 2020, despite some early COVID-related disruptions to the economy. But here are business and non-business filings. You can see that it got coiled like a spring. This is from a smaller base now. The smaller this number gets, the worse it's going to seem in the history books. What's going to seem in the history books? Everything I'm telling you is going to happen next. So those bankruptcies and delinquencies, both very low right now. The consumer is strong, but that's part of the problem. It's going to start from a low base. We're going to have a big increase. I've said that, and I've explained it to you for quite a while now.
Inc. and Mountain Province Diamonds Inc. are other issuers on Fitch Ratings' top market list that could default before year-end 2022. Bath & Beyond Inc. are other sizable issuers we forecast to default in 2023 but may default earlier.
But do you remember when Janet Yellen's talking about the $1 trillion coin, which is about $20,000 with the platinum in it? And that's what they said, okay, everyone, this is a $1 trillion coin. I'm going to put this in the bank and now we can borrow more money. Do you guys see how insane this is? I'm sorry. I should just shut up and put my head down and not say a word, but wow. So before we get into the good one, defaults, which is not a good one, it's the worst one. That's why I say the good one. Has there ever been a default in the United States from the government side of things? Let's get into that right now. The American government is defaulting right now on inflation. That's a way to default. You owe somebody $100. You go, okay, I'll pay you the nominal amount down the road. When that $100 is watered down by monetary creation, it's easy to pay off. Look at Venezuela. They had rampant hyperinflation. Rampant. And what happened is that it became easier to pay down the debts that they had. They owe $1 billion. And all of a sudden, $1 billion is the number of bills you have in your wallet. The government is doing that right now. They can't pay the debts they have unless we have low interest rates. The economy is getting nuts with inflation, so they go, let's raise interest rates. What do you think is going to happen? I think everything I'm telling you is going to happen exactly. And that's not good for me. It's not good for business. It's not good for you. It's not good for anybody. But I'm just telling you, I'm sorry, I'm just telling you what I clearly see. I'm wrong plenty of the time. This is not trading advice. How else can this go? Somebody tell me how else this could go.
Presently, retail, telecom, and broadcasting media are likely to drive the default rate in 2023-2024. Fitch Ratings analysts believe that those sectors could comprise more than half of next year's default volume, with these sectors reaching roughly 10% rates.
This is from The Globalist, great publication. Does the United States have a stellar credit record, or is it a nation of deadbeats? Well, it will eventually be a nation of deadbeats. Right now, we're doing all right. And this is a good article. That's why it's such an old article. I wanted to pull this one out because it says a lot of things that I need you to know. America has, in fact, defaulted on several occasions. 1970 default episode. When President George Washington signed the Funding Act of 1790, the act deferred interest payments on this debt until 1801. By most estimates, this was a default. And it was. You can default from the time aspect too. If you say, whatever you say, I'm going to give you $100 in 7 days on this exact date at this time, you could not make the time, you could not do it on the right date, you could not give the money that's owed. That's all a default, different shades of the same thing. The 1861 default episode. Beginning of the Civil War, the United Federal Government created the so-called greenbacks, which are today's dollars, in 1861. These were demand notes that could be redeemed at a specified conversion rate into gold. But almost right away, in 1862, the government refused to redeem them for gold. After that, the greenbacks became legal tender that could not be redeemable on demand. That's a default. 1833 default episode. Roosevelt, he found the economy in shambles. He took a lot of emergency actions. Some orthodox, others not so much. One of the more unorthodox actions related to the U.S. government bonds issued many years earlier. In 1917, after entering World War I, the U.S. Congress passed the first and second Liberty Bond Acts. In fact, it is the second Liberty Bond Act that is widely considered the legislative root of today's debt ceiling. This measure allowed the U.S. Treasury to issue long-term and short-term debt up to a certain limit, rather than seeking, as was previously required, specific congressional authorization for each borrowing transaction. They're saying, if we change the laws, we're doing it legitimately, but now we don't have to get authorization for the expenses that we take on. These Liberty bonds also included a gold clause. Do you see how it's like, I'm not just talking about gold. Gold is always being around. It will always be around. Everybody misunderstands gold right now. I do not know why. Maybe because it hasn't done anything for you lately. What did you do for me lately? That's why people aren't caring about gold like they should. But the good news is that it's not individuals, retail investors who are buying gold. When the demand trends really ramp up, it's going to be a lot of central banks that have gotten wise to the complete clown show that is our economy. Such restructuring of contractual debt constitutes a default by today's definition. In February 1935, Supreme Court deemed the congressional resolution as constitutional in a 5-4 decision. Do you see how closely it is? And especially when some of those judges are appointed by people who have certain vested interests. It's 5-4. It's a wash. It's a coin flip. And then it's just, 5's bigger than 4. So that means that this is law. This is okay to do this. We did this by the book. It's all okay. No, it's just a bunch of incremental cuts. Death by 1,000 cuts is what you're dealing with, the way that this government and economy runs. Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes, who wrote the majority opinion, described the resolution as immoral but legal. It was immoral because it's a default, and it was only legal because 5 of you agreed instead of 4. The 1979 default episode. In 1979, the Wall Street Journal reported that the U.S. Treasury had failed to make timely payments in redeeming Treasury bills for 2 reasons that they gave. And I'll read the reasons because it's kind of funny. The first reason was a disruptive relocation of the offices issuing the checks. What a weak and lame excuse. The second reason was the postponement of several securities auctions because of congressional debate over the national debt ceiling. What a brutal and lame excuse. If the government worked for me, I would fire them within day one. Oh, we can't pay what we owe and what we agreed to pay you and what we are legally, contractually obligated to pay you, because we got to argue about whether or not we should have a cap on an imaginary amount of money we can spend. Do you guys see how insane this system is that we are operating beneath? Over a period of 3 weeks in 1979, U.S. Treasury Department failed to send out checks on time for an amount totaling $122 million. Again, by all modern definition, this constitutes a default, even if it was somewhat technical in nature. $122 million does not feel technical to me. The U.S. Treasury thought it had no liability, relying on the Supreme Court decision in Smythe v. United States, 1937, which was another case to reach the Supreme Court on the gold clause issue. Do you see the ongoing constant denominator in all of every long-term country's financial system? Its relation to gold is the number one thing. It was tied to gold, and that's when the currency was not fiat. And they say, it's too hard to borrow money. We can't get away with what we want to do. We can't just create a whole bunch of money. So let's cut loose the gold clause. We do not have to give you gold, even though we promised you already that we would. And it's legal. We'll just argue about it in the courts. There's nothing to do with legality. If you say you owe me $100, you either pay me or you don't. That's default or not. I'm sorry to read you a lot of this article, but there's really good parts in this. In fact, the 1937 decision even referred back to the Public Credit Act of 1869, which had attempted to revert back to binding the government to make its debt payments in gold. The 2013 default episode. The hardened political stance of congressional Republicans will push the issue of a possible debt default to the very edge. You guys probably remember this. This was much more recently in history. If you remember what a phone booth is, you probably were around during this time. The United States has already pierced the debt ceiling. However, certain Treasury operations are able to stave off default. And last thing from this article, and it's really interesting, so I'm going to read it to you. Alternatively, it has been suggested that the President could invoke the 14th Amendment. This hardly known amendment has a clause that states that the validity of public debt of the United States, authorized by law, shall not be questioned. On this basis, the President could declare the U.S. debt ceiling to be unconstitutional and authorize the Treasury Department to raise debt in excess of it. And this video is dedicated to the Peter Leeds Army and everybody that enlisted in it. You guys are firing me up. I don't know if you can tell. I'm doing more videos, better videos, and I'm talking louder apparently. Sorry. But also, shout out to our newest Army enlistee, Richard K.